Right, welcome to this lecture on marketing strategy. I'm going to introduce some ideas about what strategy is. I'm sure many of you may have already done strategic management or business strategy in other courses. And what you'll notice with strategy is that it is quite similar throughout the different disciplines because it's more about a thought process and decision making rather than something that's specific to one discipline only. So even though this course is on marketing strategy, a lot of the concepts will be quite familiar to those of you that have a background in strategy or have done strategy papers in other courses or universities. So let's start with some general definitions. Because this is a paper on marketing strategy, David Acker is the sort of one of the gurus in marketing, and he has written many textbooks and papers on marketing management and marketing strategy and branding. And so I'll start with his definition because it is one that is very marketing strategy sort of friendly. He defines strategy as a process that can allow an organization to concentrate its resources on the optimal opportunities with the goals of increasing sales and achieving a sustainable competitive advantage. So this is obviously a very business-orientated definition of strategy, and it's also quite marketing strategy friendly because we have an emphasis on increasing sales. We talk about opportunities, and obviously his definition is situated within an organization, which we typically assume means either a for-profit or sometimes a non-profit organization. But in any case, it's very business friendly. A couple of, specific areas I would like to point out in Acker's definition is that, first of all, it's a process. So this suggests that it's something that is that has sort of movement to it or change, or it's dynamic. It's something that is done rather than something that just kind of exists as a noun. So it's more of a verb and less of a noun. It exists in an organization. We've already mentioned that. The next part of his definition talks about concentrating resources. So this idea of resources and how important it is to strategy is very, very significant, and I will go back to that point. So just in the back of your mind, remember this idea of resources. And then he talks about opportunities, and so this involves, understanding your surroundings, the environment, the situation that you're in, because you have to figure out which opportunities you're going to go for, given the resources that you have. And then it talks about goals, and specifically they talk about increasing sales. And so this is where his definition of strategy might deviate from other disciplines. For instance, if you're talking about war strategy, then increasing sales is not going to be relevant. So this is why it's a very business orientated definition. And then he finishes off talking about achieving a sustainable competitive advantage. So something that the strategy will enable the business to hopefully keep doing rather than having it as a one-off fluke or one thing that cannot be replicated later on. Because if you're going to invest all these resources into pursuing specific goals within specific opportunities, then ideally the strategy should have a little bit of a longevity to it. Now obviously that doesn't mean it's set in stone and it never changes, but it does mean that strategy hopefully accumulates into something that is more than just a one-off project, that it does become something that will be an asset to the company or the organization moving forward, so that it can continue to pursue those goals and those opportunities. The second definition is a little bit more pithy, a bit more concise. So it's simply, Max McKeown simply defines strategy as desirable ends with available means. I really like this definition because, first of all, it's quite broad, so it's different from David Acker's in the sense that it's not just a definition of strategy that is applicable only to business. You could easily apply Max's definition of strategy to anything from war through to building a house, through to business, obviously. So it has two main components. One is desirable ends. So another way of thinking about this are objectives or goals. And the other thing is available means. And so what I like to interpret that as is resources, once again. So the available resources, right? So another way you could rephrase Max McKeown's definition is desirable goals with available resources. So once again, it's this idea of resources becoming very important again, and I will sort of reveal what I'm talking about in the subsequent slide. And the final definitions down the bottom is more of a history of where strategy comes from. So strategy comes from the word strategia, which roughly translates to the art of generalship. So generalship being, you know, in wartime you have people that command most of the troops, and in that sense those troops are resources. And similar to business strategy, with war strategy you also have desirable ends that you're trying to attain, certain objectives, whether it be political or some other form of objectives or goals, to take over this piece of land or to hang on to your territory, to liberate these people over here, or to subjugate these other people to your will. So with war, there are goals and there are also resources once again. It's just that I guess the consequences of war strategy are slightly different from business strategy. So luckily, we are in a fortunate position that when we make strategic decisions, it's usually not life and death. And so strategia, or the art of generalship, talks about a high-level plan to achieve goals under conditions of uncertainty. So this is probably the first time where this idea of uncertainty is mentioned in terms of trying to define what strategy is. And in my opinion, the conditions of uncertainty is another critical component of strategy. So in the next slide, I'm going to talk about my thoughts on strategy and to try and come up with a definition that essentially I've cobbled together, having read and thought about strategy quite a lot. So my thoughts on strategy. I define strategy as the analytical decisions that implement and integrate executable tactics in order to achieve SMART goals under conditions of limited resources and competitive uncertainty. So I'm going to break this up and focus on those parts that are of the definition that are highlighted or in bold. So the first thing I want to draw your attention to is that, in my opinion, strategy is mentioned before, it's a verb, not a noun. So it's something you do. And so therefore, analytical decisions is, in my mind, what I think strategy is about. It's about making decisions, but not just, you know, simple decisions like a choice between whether you go for a hamburger or a cheeseburger, but decisions that require some analytical thought, some critical thinking, some data, hopefully, that you're trying to figure out, what does this mean, and what can I do with this information? So the first part of strategy in my mind is analytical decisions. So decisions that mean something, that are quite difficult, that aren't just easy choices to make. And then those decisions usually involve implementing or integrating executable tactics. And later on, we'll talk about the difference between strategy and tactics. But for the purposes of this particular slide, in my definition of strategy, these executable tactics are things that you can do, things that your organization or your business or your corporation can actually do. Because there's no point in making decisions to do stuff that your company can't actually do, whether it be financial or for logistical reasons, just can't be achieved. Now, this doesn't mean that you shouldn't try and solve the problem so that you can execute some of these tactics if they prove to be very important. But usually in strategy, you're making decisions about what to do, and the thing that you want to do is something that is, at least logically feasible within the business organization's capabilities, right? So you're making decisions on what to do in order to achieve SMART goals. And this goes back to the original definition of strategies, where there's always either desirable means or some sort of objective or goals. I've just put SMART goals in there because, being in business, we think about SMART goals all the time, right? So these are specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely goals. So that just makes that that side of the end game a little bit more specific and a little bit more attainable, right? Under conditions of limited resource, so once again, this is the significance of this idea of limited resources. So no business, no organization, no country has unlimited resources. And in terms of resources, usually we think about them in terms of cost, money, financial resources, but obviously there's also time costs, and there's also skill and effort costs, right? And so the importance of resources in strategy is that in a situation where there are unlimited resources, such as you have all the money you need, all the time to do it, all the effort that can be mustered, as well as all the skills that are required. If you are in a situation where you have all those things and you have no limited resources or no limits on your resource, then theoretically you don't need to make any analytical decisions. So think about that. If you have all the resources you need, then there is no need for strategy. There is no need to make analytical, critical decisions about what to do next, right? Because if you have unlimited resources, then you just do everything over and over again until something works. You've got unlimited time, you've got unlimited money you can throw at it, you've got people with the skills to do whatever you want them to do in terms of the executable tactics, etc., and your workforce has unlimited effort that they can expand, the energy they can invest into your goals that you're looking for, right? But we know that in reality, that is never the case. You are always in a situation where you have limited resources. And because of that, that is why we need to make analytical decisions about the very limited number of things that we can do, these executable tactics, in order to achieve those goals, right? And the final part of my definition revolves around competitive uncertainty, right? So even if you had unlimited resources, that's not to say that you're still in a certain environment where you can predict everything, right? And so I've got competitive uncertainty there to signify that, in business or in war, there's going to be people that are doing stuff that are basically the opposite of what you want them to do. Whether it's your competitors trying to get people to switch to their brand, or your suppliers trying to get a little bit more money from you, or your customers trying to push down what you can charge them for, right, for your brand or product or service. And so this competitive environment, this competitive uncertainty is the final key element of strategy, because you don't know what exactly is going to happen, and so that always has to be at the back of your mind when you're making strategy. In other words, there is no blueprint that you can follow. It's not like, building a kit set model or a house or a piece of furniture that you assemble from IKEA. It's not like you have instructions, and if you follow this, then you will exactly end up where you want to end up. In strategy, because you've got limited resources in terms of time, cost, effort, etc., and because people are trying to outwit you and do stuff that you don't exactly want them to do, or they're trying to get to the same goals that you're trying to get to before you get there, because all this stuff is happening, that once again goes all the way back to the beginning of this definition, whereas it's the key thing about strategy are these analytical decisions, right? What are you going to do given everyone else is trying to do stuff that's not what you're planning for them to do, given that you only have limited resources so you can't spend money on everything, given that there's only a certain number of executable tactics your business can do at this given time frame. There are a lot of limits, and with these limits comes the necessity to make really hard decisions. And that really is what, in my mind, defines strategy. Now, the next slide, I'm going to talk about the same thing, but in visual format, just so that other people that think more visually, and I'm a visual thinker, can also understand exactly what I'm talking about to do with this exact definition here. So in this slide, I'm going to talk about the definition that I provided in the previous slide, but in a visual format. So let's start off at the center. So these are those goals, these SMART objectives. What are you going to try to achieve, because you can't achieve everything in a certain time frame and given the limited resources you have. So you've got to focus on the goals. Given you've decided what goals or objectives you want to pursue, the next step is to think about the tactics. So these are the things that your company can actually execute. What can your company do given the time frame and the goals that you are aiming to achieve, because your company can't do everything, right? So what are the things you can do that will get you to those goals through the path of least resistance? Next step up, so this is why I've colored it red and I've underlined it, analytical decisions. So the critical part of strategy is making those decisions about the type of things you're going to do to get to the goals you want to get to, right? And underlying those decisions you're making is your limited resources, right? Because as I mentioned before, if you have unlimited resources, then you don't need to make any decisions, right? In the event that you can spend as much money as you want and you have as much time as you need and everyone can do exactly what you want with 100% maximum effort all the time, then you just chuck stuff at the situation until you get to the goals. because there's no time limit, there's no cost limit. Just do anything, whatever, doesn't matter. Eventually you'll get there through just fluke, right? But given that we do have limited resources, such as time, cost, effort, energy, etc., then you're going to have to focus. That's why the analytical decisions is the center point of strategic thinking. So after you've realized that you have these limited resources, the biggest circle, which I guess symbolizes the situation around you, the context that you find yourself in, is this idea of competitive uncertainty. So I mentioned before how all this stuff is happening around you in the business environment or in the war environment. People are trying to do things that literally have the opposite goals of what you're trying to achieve. You're trying to increase your value. People are trying to push it down, decrease their cost. And so, all this stuff is happening and you can't predict anything really. You can only, analyze the type of resources you have in order to make those decisions to get you to do the tactics that your company can actually do, and hopefully you'll get to those goals, right? And so a lot of marketing strategy and a lot of strategy in general talks about this big picture and understanding as much as you can the competitive environment around you is really important. Because it is competitive uncertainty, you can't know everything, nor can you predict everything. But the more you try to understand what's happening around you, the more it allows you to think, okay, well, given this is what I know about what's happening around me, and given these are the limited resources I have, I think these are the choices we should make about what we should do in order to get to those goals that we think are the most important for our company at this given moment. So, the key components of strategy, this is another way of considering the different components that you need to take into account when you're thinking strategically. So scope, meaning sort of where to compete. So once again, this is a choice you have to make because you can't compete everywhere, and nor would you want to. So you need, and when I say where, I don't just mean in a physical, regional, geographical point of view, although that could be within your scope. But really, scope is more about the abstract where as well, the metaphorical where. So that means positioning. I typically think of brand positioning, right? Where do you want your brand to be? What are you going to do in order to get your brand to that position within the mental mind map of your consumers so that you're competing where you want to compete, right? So if you're an automobile manufacturer, do you compete with the high-end luxury premium European brands, or do you compete with the low-cost Asian brands, right? You have to make that decision in terms of where to compete. And that is a position within the geography of the mind of your consumer, but it might also be a regional decision. Second component of strategy are these goals and objectives, and we talked about these already, so I don't need to dwell too long on that point. Resource deployments, that's the third component. So once again, we mentioned this about the importance of how you allocate these limited resources. And the final point here are these identifications of sustainable competitive advantage. So that was mentioned in one of the earlier definitions, but basically this is, how will the organization compete and how will they continue to compete? You want to have your strategy end up with something that you're doing within the company that has a longevity to it or some sort of shelf life. It can't be a one-off thing because that is more tactical thinking. It has to be sort of a bit longer term in terms of your planning. And who to compete against. So this is also about, you have to take into account within this competitive uncertainty that, people are doing stuff. And so who is a company or who is a rival that you actually need to worry about versus people that might not necessarily be your rivals. In fact, maybe they can actually be collaborators, right? So trying to consider who you're competing against in order to make sure that it's not going to be too much effort and too much resource allocation in order for you to continue to compete over the long time or the long period, right? So a classic example of this is if you're coming up with a new soft drink, then you probably don't want to compete directly with the giants like Coca-Cola or Pepsi immediately. You want to kind of do stuff on the fringes, operate under the radar long enough to establish, market share and brand loyalty. Because you don't want them to notice you too early because they will either do everything they can to stop you from getting momentum, or they'll just try and buy you out, or they will put the squeeze on your suppliers, or even put the squeeze on your buyers, as in your retailers. and try and push you out of the market that way, right? So that's a decision of who to compete against, at a very sort of, using a very concrete example. So looking now at goals, strategy, and tactics. I mentioned earlier that there's a difference between strategy and tactics, and we'll talk about that in the slide. But let's start off with these goals, because that is, if you recall the diagram that I used in my definition of strategy, that's the center point, right? And so I talk about SMART goals, but other people talk about goals in a more generic sense, so observable, measurable, end result, having one or more objectives to be achieved within a more or less fixed time frame. So this is kind of similar to SMART objectives anyway, but the key thing to remember is that a goal is not a strategy, right? No, if you go back to that figure, the goal is just one part of the strategy. It's a very important central part of the strategy, because that's the focus that's going to drive you to where you want to get to, right? So that directs the strategy, or rather the strategy or the analytical decisions you make are done in a way that focuses your resources and your tactics so that you head straight towards that goal, right? So you need the goal in the distance, because that is what's driving you towards your strategy, or that's what's pulling you in that direction. So goals are very important, but goals by themselves are not a strategy, right? The sort of example I like to give is, imagine there's a mountain in the distance and there's a peak on that mountain. You want to get to that peak. Well, that is your goal. I want to get to the top of that peak, that mountain, in 6 months' time. So that's your goal. That's not a strategy, right? Your strategy is, well, what decisions that I'm going to make now within the 6 months that will get me to that peak on the mountain, right? So strategy is a conceptualization of how that goal can be achieved. So getting to the top of a mountain, I suspect within your analytical decision making framework, there might be something like training, there might be things like equipment that you need, et cetera, et cetera. So any number of strategies can be used to achieve a business goal or a life goal or a nation goal. So that's the other thing, because if a strategy is about the type of analytical decisions you make, then obviously you can make more than one decision, right? And different people within your team might make different decisions. So that's the importance of sort of teamwork within strategy, is that you want as many different decisions as possible so that you can really consider all the options. And then eventually you have to pick something and go with it. But in the sort of beginning phase of strategic thinking, you want a lot of different decisions being thrown up there and brainstormed, because someone could come up with an idea that's completely wacky, but then later on the team might think, actually this is executable, and it's actually the path of least resistance. Sometimes the most obvious things might not be the best decisions either. So within your groups, when you start to work on your project, just consider that, bear that in mind, that strategy, because it is about decision making, there is not one decision that is the right answer for any given situation. And finally, tactics. So I mentioned how strategy are not tactics. So tactics are these actions that you take to execute the strategy. So these are the little steps you do in order to get you to that mountain in the distance. So when we talk within marketing strategy, often tactics and strategy kind of get confused. So TV advertising, magazine ads, retail promotions, putting together a website, using social media. These are not theoretically strategies, these are tactics. So for those of you doing my other paper on advertising and promotions, when we talk about your communication strategy or your IMC campaign, now that is a little bit more, that's kind of in between marketing strategy or business strategy and actually tactics, right? So the way I like to sort of, I guess, illustrate is that you've got, let's imagine you're the brand manager for a company and you're making shampoo, right? You're going to have a strategy to do with your shampoo in terms of where you want to compete, right? Who your customers are, what type of value proposition you have, how you're going to negotiate with your suppliers and your retailers, all that sort of stuff. That's the strategy. This is that high level sort of thinking. Now, tactics are things like, okay, I've got this brand of shampoo. Should we use TV advertising or should we use social media influencers? Should we have a magazine ad? What should it say in that magazine ad? Which magazine should we target? These are more tactics. So often when we do marketing strategy, a common mistake that students make within their assignments and also when they enter the real world is that they focus too much on tactics and they forget about the analytical decisions they're making before they decide to execute those tactics. So thinking about chucking a bus ad, a bus shelter ad combined with a magazine ad and then a little bit of social media influencer activity, that's not really strategic thinking, that's more tactical thinking. Now, tactics are very important because you need to do those things for people to, increase awareness and build up brand loyalty towards your shampoo, but those on their own, that's not a strategy. The strategy is everything that happens before you decide to go for that magazine ad or that bus shelter ad, etc., etc. It's all the stuff that happens before in terms of brand positioning, value offering, even all the way back to, how do we design the shampoo to make it unique? What is its unique selling proposition? Who do we have to hire? What chemists do we have to use in order to design a shampoo product that can compete in this position within the customer's minds, where there's a gap? How feasible is it to pursue that gap? What's the size of that gap? How many people are within that market? Is it a growing market? Is it a declining market? Is anyone else thinking about going into that gap as well? All these sorts of high-level decisions. That's the strategy. By the time you get down to the advertising and promotion part of it, that is more tactical. And so for those of you doing my class in marketing strategy, as well as my class in advertising and promotions, you'll notice the assignments that we set up are very different, right? The advertising and promotion stuff does lend itself more to tactical thinking because the strategic thinking leading up to that point has already been done for you. You're already working with a client with an existing product, right? So it's almost too late to think too strategically for that because the product's already been made. They just want you to advertise and promote it, right? They want you to market it in the traditional sense. So this is when you start to think about, given the position that brand already has or is designed to take, what are the tactics we need to introduce in order to get to that point, get to those goals. However, for marketing strategy, for this paper, you're working with clients where it is about thinking strategically. So don't worry about the type of ads they may or may not do just yet. Think about their business. Think about, what other offerings can they design in order to capture maximum value from the market share, from the market? How can they, do something to gain market share? Is there a gap that they're not quite leveraging or targeting that none of their competitors are going for yet, right? So that's kind of more of the pre-thinking, those analytical decisions that you make before you launch into the advertising and promotions part of it. So I don't mean to put down the importance of tactics because they are very important. As I mentioned, if you think about, that the peak of the mountain in the distance as the goal, and your strategy is, okay, what decisions am I going to make to get there? I need to train. I need to think about nutrition. I need to figure out who can get me to the base camp there. I need to think about what type of equipment I purchase. Who's the best supplier? Where can I go? All that's the strategic thinking, but at the end of the day, you're still going to need to have the tactics, as in, well, we're going to have to take this path here because on the map it shows it's the easiest ascent, and then we are going to pitch camp at this altitude here, rest for an evening, and then the next day we're going to have breakfast at 7 a.m. because we need to get up early, and then we're going to go exactly 5 kilometers that way, and then we're going to have another night. So those are the tactics, and you can see they are very important because often you can have a great strategy, but if the tactics aren't executed correctly, you're not going to get to that mountain. Right, I'm going to use an example using Starbucks to illustrate the relationship between goals, strategy, and tactics. So Starbucks might have a goal of being the world's largest coffee seller in terms of sales targets. So they'll have a specific time frame and a specific sales target to make their goal smart. Then in terms of strategy, so these are the analytical decisions that they will be making in order to achieve that goal. That might involve the strategy of, okay, let's get each customer to spend more every time they visit a store, right? So that means all the decisions that they will be making from this point forward will be to direct those limited resources they have, and even Starbucks, which is a massive multinational corporation, even they will have limited resources, right? So what are we going to do to take all the limited resources we have in order to make each customer spend more every time they step foot into one of our retail chains or one of our stores? The tactics then, the things the business will execute given their limited resources might be, okay, well, we've got budget aside to research and develop some new egg sandwiches, right? Maybe we'll invest a little bit of market research, figure out if people like that, and then if they do, we can invest and develop this new product, right? So this is a tactic that you can do in order to achieve that goal, which is to become the world's largest coffee seller by increasing your sales target, and you're doing that by getting people to spend more every time they step foot into one of your retail stores. Another tactic related to that analytical decision, how to get people to spend more in the store, is, okay, well, we know they come in to buy, our frappes and our cappuccinos or whatever it is, but what if we also have different types of mugs, or maybe even coffee machines that they can purchase when they step into the store, right? So now you're getting people to spend more by selling them other stuff in addition to the coffee that they've come in to purchase in the first place. So once again, this is a tactic that fits in very well with the analytical decision that you're making to get people to spend more when they enter your store. And there might be other examples like, okay, when people come in, what if we invent a new type of premium luxury coffee, a really limited edition, and we'll put a massive markup on it, and then when they come in to buy their normal coffee, maybe we'll point them in this direction, so this is the decision you're making, and then when they buy that coffee, we get a bigger profit margin, and this will help us achieve those sales targets and become the world's largest coffee seller. So this is just one example of how a certain goal can be achieved through a certain strategy, and that strategy leads you to make decisions about the type of tactics you're going to execute. In the next slide, I'll talk about the same goal achieved through different strategy and different tactics. On the other hand, you might have the same goal, become the world's largest coffee seller through specific sales targets. However, you could be making a very different type of decision. Your decision here might be, okay, well, let's get the customer to spend money on Starbucks outside of the retail outlet. So if you recall the previous slide, the analytical decisions you were going to make was, what do we do to get people to spend more when they come into the store? However, for this particular strategy, to try to achieve the same goal, you're thinking, okay, how can we get people to spend money on the company when they're not even within our store, right? And there might be different reasons for you to come up with that analytical decision making framework, but they could be equally valid. And so if you're going to make this sort of decision to achieve those same goals for Starbucks, then what are the tactics that will emerge from this sort of decision making? So the tactics then could be, well, let's increase merchandise sold out of the store, right? So the previous slide was get them to spend more when they come in. This is, what can we do to get them to spend money on Starbucks when they're not in our store, right? It could be sell bulk coffee at retail outlets. So now all of a sudden you're putting your product, your brand, into the other sort of supply chain. You're putting it into the retail outlets, which are completely different from your own retail restaurants or your retail stores. So now you've kind of doubled the footprint where people can purchase your brand. They can come into the store and buy your stuff, but they can also get your stuff when they do their local, go to their local supermarket every week for their groceries. Right? So this is another tactic that aligns with the strategy, which is to make people spend more on Starbucks when they're not actually at Starbucks. You can create an instant coffee for maybe offices to buy so that they can, when they, a lot of offices have places where staff can make coffee. So maybe you want to get in and create an instant coffee that other corporations and other offices can buy, and therefore they are spending money on Starbucks when they are not going into your store. And then that might mean that even when the employees don't go to Starbucks, maybe they're busy, they're stuck at the office, well, they can still be spending money on Starbucks, right? Because their company is providing them with this instant coffee when they haven't even gone into your store. There'll be other examples, moving stuff online, etc., etc. So what we've seen in this slide and in the previous slide are two, very different analytical decisions that you're making, which then result in very different tactics. However, all of it aim to achieve the same goal. Now, a company like Starbucks might be able to do both, right? Because maybe they have slightly more resources and they decide to do both decisions. So on the one hand, we're going to get them to spend more when they come into the store. On the other hand, we are also going to get them to spend more money when they're out of the store, right? And so, yeah, sure, if you've got unlimited resources or actually, large number of resources, you might be able to do both. But you also have to think, is that the most efficient use of your resources, right? And so if we compare this strategy with the previous one on the last slide, in some ways, even though they're trying to achieve the same goal, it might not be the best use of resources because they can be counterproductive in some sense. So just as a quick example, if you have some people deciding to go for this strategy, they're voting for this one, let's get people to spend more when they're outside of the store, and then you have people on the team on the other slide going, no, we think we should get people to spend more in the store. Well, the way they might be counterproductive or they might clash, and then you end up wasting resources, is that, okay, if you're going to create an instant coffee, or if you're going to sell your coffee at a supermarket and people can buy your stuff at the supermarket, well, then maybe they're actually reducing the number of trips they go into your stores, into your restaurant/coffee shops, right? And so in a way, the two strategies might result in cannibalization of your customers. So a customer may not go into a Starbucks store to buy a coffee that's been made for them, and then at the same time, go back to the office and have another instant coffee by the Starbucks brand, right? They might be all coffeeed out by then, right? Similarly speaking, if you have the person that makes the purchase decisions in the household go to the supermarket and they buy a bulk pack of coffee beans from Starbucks from Countdown or Foodtown, well, they might think, well, we've got this at home now, we might as well make it. Why are we wasting money going to the coffee shop every day, right? So you can see how the two strategies, even though they might achieve the same goals, might actually be counterproductive, and then you're spending resources on tactics that will end up canceling each other out. And so once again, this goes back to my idea of why the key idea of strategy are these analytical decisions. What choices are you going to make? Even a massive company like Starbucks with a lot of resources should still be making these tough decisions, because there's no point in throwing money at tactics that are just going to cancel each other out or be counterproductive. There should be this idea that you're thinking of, the best way to get to your goal with the least amount of resources expended. So where does marketing fit in? By now, we've discussed how marketing strategy is more than just tactics. However, in addition to that, marketing is in the best position to understand things like customers, what they want, who they are, the company's offerings in terms of what the company can provide, what else they should perhaps provide, what the competitors are doing, and environmental forces acting around the organization. Society, what gets them irate, what are they passionate about, all that sort of stuff. That's the marketer's role, right? To have their finger on the pulse of society and on the world and on their customers and what the competitors are doing, etc., etc. So given that so much of strategy revolves about understanding what's happening around you, and then also what you can do within your organization in order to decide what you're going to do with all those, with the limited resources you have in order to get those goals, marketing is in a really good position to contribute to business strategy. And so marketing strategy is basically how, marketers think, how they make those analytical decisions based on their skill set in order to achieve the goals of the greater organization. Marketers also have, or the marketing department has, access and control of customer data, so that's super important in terms of understanding your key stakeholders, as well as other strategic assets. So marketers or the marketing department is responsible for the brands, which are one of the most valuable assets for any organization. And they're also, in charge of the relationship databases usually, right? As well as external collaborative relationships, such as sponsorships, etc. So given that marketing is responsible for all these important bits of information and assets within an organization, and given that their job is essentially to understand the customers and what the competitors are doing and what society wants, well then it's really, I guess, obvious that marketers should be involved with any strategic decision making, right? Because that is basically what the role of marketing is. It's to be that link between what the company does in here and what they're trying to achieve out there. So marketing is a critical component of strategic rollout. The way I like to sort of think about this, and it kind of gets me a little bit irate, is that often marketers are seen as the advertiser guys, right? The advertising dudes, where, you know, we already have this widget, this thing that the engineers have made. Go and sell it, right? Find some place that will want to buy this thing. So that's typically what people think of when they think of advertising and, by default, marketing. You know, what is it that you do? Oh, you sell soap, basically, to suckers, right? Well, if you think about what I've just mentioned about how, you know, marketers have their finger on the pulse of society, they have access to customer information, they're in charge of the database, they are in charge of the relationships with other companies, they understand what the competitors are doing. Because marketers know so much about what's happening outside the organization, don't you think that they should actually be the ones telling the R&D engineers what they should be designing next? Shouldn't marketers be the ones saying, actually, we don't need this widget because there's no market for it, but what we do know of the customers is that they really want this type of thing. And we also know that the competitors aren't doing something like this. So why don't you go back to your lab and come up with something which I know will sell because I know there is a market for it, right? And so this is kind of flips the way we should be thinking about marketing. It shouldn't be the last thing the organization does once they've already made the product and the widget and they want to sell it. It should be the first thing. We should be at the decision-making table when we decide exactly what product we're going to make. What is the value that we're trying to offer? Get marketers in there thinking strategically first, rather than just giving them the stuff that's made a fait accompli that, you know, they just need to go and sell it. Sometimes you can't sell something where there is no market for it. You can't sell a solution for a problem that doesn't exist. You know, well, often marketers try and do that by creating problems that don't exist, right? They try and convince people that there is a problem so that they can sell this thing that's already been made. But how about we actually look at what the real problems are and then come up with a solution for that, because then that's much easier to sell, right? And so that's basically where marketing fits in to, you know, strategy and business strategy more broadly speaking. So marketing strategy is more about the woods as opposed to the trees. So it's about the big picture. And I hope the previous slides have already kind of made that pretty obvious about understanding, you know, stuff that's happening around the business, but also sort of long-term thinking. Whereas traditional marketing, you know, the situation I described earlier where you're given the soap, just go and sell it, that is all about tactics because you've had no input into how that soap should be designed and what its unique selling proposition is. You're basically stuck with tactics. You know, okay, I've got the soap, I have to sell it, let's do some bus ads, let's do some magazine ads, let's get an influencer, right? Because there's really not much you can work with strategically at that point. And so this is what traditional marketing typically is about. It's about, you know, selling soap to suckers. So that's very much the trees and not the forest. So that's the specific things that you're doing to try and sell this piece of soap, right? Whereas strategic marketing, and the way I want you to approach this course, is to think about it in terms of the forest. So the whole thing, okay, before we try and sell the soap, let's just take a step back and take, you know, elevate ourselves and look at the whole forest. Okay, what are the customers we're trying to target? Are they a growth market in the long term? Is it worth pursuing them now, establishing brand loyalty, and they'll stick with this, and when they get bigger and richer, then we'll be able to, you know, really cash in at that point. What are the competitors doing? What soap are they already selling? Well, there's no point in creating something that's just going to do the same thing over there. Let's figure out what the customers really want. What's the problem they want solved? You know, is the soap drying out their skin? Well, maybe there's, you know, we should design a more moisturizing sort of soap, etc., etc., etc. And so good strategic marketing takes the whole forest approach. It understands that big picture first before it dives into the specific trees, which is, you know, okay, now that we've designed this soap that no one else has got, that's serving this very specific purpose, then we can advertise using these very specific tactics, right? And instead of just blanketing the whole of the market with ads everywhere, because you're not quite sure who you're targeting, you can then get very targeted and go, okay, well, there is a specific social media influencer or a small number of them that have dry skin or whatever. They're known for their hypoallergenic, lifestyles. And so why don't we get them to promote the soap, etc., etc., right? So, but you have to, in order to get to that very specific type of tactic first, that hopefully has more cut through and is a little bit more resource efficient, you need to have done the big picture thinking leading up to that point, right? If you get the soap just chucked onto your desk and sort of the instructions to go and sell it, to go and market it, it's too late by then and you're stuck with just being able to do individual tactics. So if you have to think big picture in order to think strategically, we need to start to figure out what stops you from thinking big picture or holistically. And I like to do that using this metaphor over here. What are these? They're silos. So silos are designed to keep individual types of grains separate from all the other grains. So in one silo you might have maize, in another silo you may have wheat, in a third silo you may have, I don't know, soybeans, whatever it might be. The point of it is to keep it separate, and in terms of business, there are, I guess, good reasons for keeping things separate sometimes. You know, when you keep things separate, it makes things easier to manage. It makes things more accountable. It makes things easier to budget for, right? And so what I guess starts off as a very logical decision-making idea in business, as in keeping units separate, does have its pitfalls if you follow that thinking too far. And often businesses do take this idea of siloed thinking too far. And so within a business, you know, which hopefully isn't about keeping, you know, different types of grains separate, it's about combining ideas, figuring out what other people are doing, having that big picture of what the other divisions of within a business are doing. You need things to mix. And the problem with silos is that because they're designed to keep things separate, people don't mix, people don't collaborate, people don't communicate, and then, even worse, people get really protective and defensive about their role within the organization, or their department within their organization, or their silo within the organization, right? Because that is their home base, that's their home team. And so we've got a budget over here, it's called a marketing budget, and no, the research and development people can't have our marketing budget because it's our budget, and we need this budget because we like to do stuff with our staff, right? And the research and development people, they have their budget, and they're like, no, well, we don't, the marketers can't have any of this budget because it's our budget. And if we don't spend every single penny, then the CFO will not give us the same amount next year, and they'll give it to someone else who is spending everything. And like the marketing department, they always spend everything, and so you know, we have to spend everything as well. So you can see how that very simple sort of illustration shows that silos are not necessarily the best tools or ways of organizing businesses in order to get that cross discipline or cross silo sort of thinking and collaboration. So the problem with silos, which I've already mentioned, are sometimes you have these different departments within an organization. That means that you misallocate these marketing resources. The example I gave in the previous slide talked about how the marketing department really wanted to hang on to their budget, and they didn't want to share it with the research and development department, right? So that's a great example of how marketing resources might be misallocated, because, you know, maybe the best way of spending that resource is to give it to the research and development people, because maybe they need more money to come up with a better widget or design a better bar of soap, which will at the end of the day make the marketer's job a lot easier, right? Because they're selling something that is already really awesome. But the way that organizations are set up, you have your marketing budget, you have your R&D budget. Often the two don't cross because the managers of both departments are protecting their resources really sort of defensively. And so they're like, no, we have our budget, you have your budget. Once you finish designing the soap, give it to me and I'll market it, right? Which kind of goes against the whole thing I talked about before, about how, you know, the marketer should be at that very beginning of the product development phase. They should be with the R&D people, and therefore, if they're going to be with them and giving them their ideas, shouldn't they also share some of their budget? Because if they're the ones, if the marketers are the ones saying, no, you need more moisturizer, or you need this special herb that's only, you know, available in Brazil, well, that's going to cost the R&D people money and resources to make those dreams come true. And so there needs to be that flexibility. But within silos, that doesn't happen. Brand dilution can happen through inconsistent positioning. So once again, you have the R&D people on one side thinking our brand is this. You've got the marketers on the other side thinking our brand is that. There might be actually a little bit of inconsistency because you're not communicating. They're trying to protect their own turf, and therefore you have this the power of the brand then gets diluted. you have missed opportunities for value bundling. And so the example I gave before of the marketing department not wanting to share the budget with the R&D department is one idea, but within large organizations, you have multiple marketing departments for multiple brands, right? So you might have a brand of cosmetics over here, you might have another brand of soaps over here, you might have a brand of shampoos over there. And so each of those departments are protecting not only their own R&D budget, but their own marketing budget as well. And so you're not finding the opportunities to cross-collaborate and value bundle because you're in those silos. The soap people aren't talking to the shampoo people aren't talking to the cosmetics people, right? And they're all just like this, when really they should be like, okay, well, can we do some sort of collaboration here? So good companies break down these silos, and they force their people to actually commingle and collaborate and come up with these value bundling, because at the end of the day, that's best for the customer. And when you do what's best for the customer, they stick with you, right? And they keep coming back. Competencies are dispersed rather than consolidated. So within silos, you can kind of imagine it already, that you have different people with different skills and they're in this department. You have other people with other skills and they're in that department. And then you have other people with other skills and talents and they're in that department. And because they're not communicating and collaborating, all these skills and competencies are separate and they stay in their silos, when really you want to get the best of every silo, put them together into like your A team, and then have them spreading out throughout the entire organization, all the various talents and skills that they have, consolidate them so they can actually get stuff working quicker, more effectively, more efficiently, etc. Success is isolated and underutilized. Once again, if you're stuck in these silos, you celebrate your successes, you are less, I guess, reluctant in some ways to share what you did to get that success with other departments because you're afraid they might steal your limelight. You might be the favorite golden child of the CEO because your particular business unit has performed, really fantastically year on year on year. You might have a secret formula happening there. You might have someone with a specific talent. Why would you share it with another department, even if they're in the same organization as you? You don't want them to be the golden child because you like the fact that the CEO thinks that your brand is really cool and it's their flagship brand. Why would you give any of that advantage to another department, even within the same organization? So you can see how company politics start to creep in, and it's actually degrading the full potential of the organization simply because of the way departments are organized in silos. Communication is often non-existent. I kind of covered that already. And when employees know where they fit in to the bigger picture, then some of these silo-driven problems can be avoided. So that's more of a solution than a problem, but I guess the problem is that people don't understand what the big picture is, where they fit in, and so they get very focused and sort of one-sided in terms of their thinking of how do they protect their turf, right? They're in this department, they work for this brand of shampoo, and so everyone else is a competitor. They want to keep their secrets. They don't want to share their success, or at least there's tactics that they use to get to that success. And so you create all these problems for the businesses and you don't reach its full potential. So if you can teach employees where they fit in, or if you, as a future employee, about to join maybe a multinational big company, if you understand where you fit in, that can actually help your career in the long run. So in my class, I show a video of Unilever. Unilever is a massive multinational corporation with hundreds of brands. This video won't work on this YouTube link because video within a video doesn't typically work. But if you're in my class, I will show you the video, and then we'll talk about Unilever in the next slide and how it's useful for their employees to understand where they fit in. In fact, a lot of corporations have hundreds of brands, and many of the employees don't sort of take a moment to understand that they are just one part of this bigger puzzle. They're just one tree within this forest that is the corporation. So within Unilever, first of all, we break things up into 3 different levels. There's the corporate level. So this is the Unilever as the corporation. So this is corporate level strategy, really big strategic thinking, where you're trying to make analytical decisions that will increase your shareholder value. That's kind of the bottom line at that corporate level. What can we do as a massive corporation to increase shareholder value, make our shares go up? What can we do to make the company more valuable? Next step down are strategic business units. And so at the strategic business unit level, we're talking more about product categories or sectors. So Unilever, as an example, have a number of strategic business units. They're operating at a number of different product category sectors, such as food, such as beverages, such as ice cream, and then home and personal care. So underneath that, and we're just going to stick with home and personal care now, and otherwise the diagram gets crazy, right? At that bottom level is the product level strategy. And so when you guys go into the workforce, it's most likely you will start off at the product level, which means that you will be assistant brand manager to someone that might be, brand manager of Rexona as a specific product within the Unilever home and personal care strategic business unit. Alternatively, you might get another job as assistant brand manager working for Close-Up, which is a brand of toothpaste that Unilever produce. Or Lux, or Axe, which is the international terminology they use for Lynx. Dove, which is one of their flagship brands. Vaseline, one of their very long-term brands. VO5, another hair care product. Surf, a laundry detergent. And Sunlight, right? So all these brands belong to Unilever. So you already kind of think, whoa, I didn't know Unilever had these brands, so aren't they competitors? Well, yeah, they are kind of competitors, because, so for instance, Lux and Dove, both produce soap as well, and so they, in a way, they compete with each other. Axe and Rexona, I guess, are, antiperspirants or deodorants. Axe mainly targeted at the male demographic and Rexona at the female, but Rexona also has a male antiperspirant, right? And so in a way they're competing as well. And so you can see how it could very easily turn into the siloed thinking that we talked about in the previous few slides, right? You're the brand manager of Rexona, you don't want X to know what you're up to because they're your competitor. And in a way the company does set it up like that because they need to create this idea of competition so that the customers have different brands that they can select. Right? If they said, okay, we're not going to do X anymore, we're going to put all of our limited resources into Rexona, and we will just have one brand of antiperspirant/deodorant. That only works to a certain extent because another company like Procter & Gamble will say, hey, they've only got Rexona, let's create another brand of antiperspirant that's targeted at teenage males. Right? And so that's why Unilever needs X, because they need to capture that teenage male market, but they also have Rexona for guys and girls that want to be seen as slightly more sophisticated, right? And so they need this competition to exist not only for competitive reasons, but also for organizational reasons, right? Because as I mentioned before, silos do fulfill a role. They make things easier to manage. They make things easier to budget for. So you need these different brands. And the more different brands that a corporation can have, the more they are seen to be competing within themselves, then the more of the other competitors they can drive out of the market. So Coca-Cola is another classic example of this. Basically half the soft drinks you see on the shelf belong to Coke, and the other half belong to Pepsi, okay? And then there's a few sort of independent players. So maybe not half each, but you get my drift. And so they create this competition on the shelves so that if you don't feel like a Coke, and you feel like something lemonade-y, then you can buy Sprite. And then Pepsi goes, well, we have 7-Up just in case there. And then we'll create Mountain Dew. But then Coke will say, well, we'll create Lift. And so they're competing with themselves, but also as a means of competing with the competitors, but also as a way of organizing their company, because you can't just have everything in the mix. So you do need those silos. But the key is for the employees to know where they belong. So if you work as the assistant brand manager for X/Lynx, then you know that you are also have this, the sister company over here called Rexona that is made by Unilever as well. And you want to make sure that what you do to position X a certain way isn't going to be the same, nor would you want it to be the same as what Rexona is doing, right? As I mentioned before, X, more the sort of, 13 to 18, maybe early 20s male demographic. Rexona, sort of the older demographic there. And so you can very happily coexist because your brand positioning is different, right? And then Once you understand where you fit in, then you know that, look, we have certain, I guess, sister, brother companies, brands that we're competing with, but also working in collaboration with. Then there's the other brands that belong to other corporations. They're the real enemy, and they're the ones we really want to compete. And between Rexona and X, hopefully we crowd out the market, and then whatever Procter & Gamble produce gets pushed out or nudged out, right? But because it's an environment of competitive uncertainty, Procter & Gamble are doing the same thing over there, right? And so both these organizations are competing with each other, flooding the market, saturating the market with many different brands. All you need to worry about as a soon-to-be marketing graduate is that when you enter the workforce, if you're lucky enough to work for a big corporation like this, then you will start down the bottom at the product level. But understanding where the products fit in with other products and where they fit in at the next level up, at the strategic business unit level, that will help your career progression. Because eventually you don't want to stay the product manager for X or Rexona or Dove. You want to move up and be making strategic level decisions at the home and personal care strategic business unit. And then from there, you want to go up again to that corporate level, right? That's where we want to see you, at that corporate, the C-suite they call it. At that higher level where you're making decisions looking sort of downwards with this overview of the forest versus the trees, right? So you start off in the trees because you have to start somewhere, and you move your way up to that corporate level. So here's an example of how various multinational corporations around the world are responsible for hundreds of brands between them. So all of the profit made from all of those individual brands at that product level eventually funnel up to the corporate level anyway. So you see there, what Coca-Cola is making, you see there what Kellogg's, what Unilever is making, Procter & Gamble, etc., etc. So a very, small number of large multinationals are responsible for almost all of the brands you see in your day-to-day life. And so understanding that when you, work for one brand, that often that brand is not just its own thing. It doesn't exist in a silo, even though it may give the appearance that it does. It belongs in a suite of all these other silos that belong to certain corporations. And if you're going to start thinking strategically, you have to understand that sort of parent-to-child relationship, right? And you want to also, I guess, be planning in terms of your own career progression to move your way up from product level to corporate level. So now that we've taken a long look at strategy, let's dial it back and think about what we mean when we talk about marketing within marketing strategy. So marketing is the activity, set of institutions, and processes for creating, communicating, delivering, and exchanging offerings that have value for customers, clients, partners, and society at large. This is that definition you should be familiar with. It's from the AMA, the American Marketing Association, the global sort of authority on marketing. I want to draw your attention to a couple of points within this definition. So the first thing is that marketing is a process, right? So similar to strategy, it's something you do rather than a noun, it's a verb. And typically it's about creating, communicating, and delivering something. I want you to focus mainly on creating because that's the first step. You have to create something before you can communicate and deliver it and exchange it, right? But essentially the 4 P's of marketing revolve around this part of the definition. Creating the product, communicating, or in other words, promoting it, right? Delivering it, that's placement, and exchanging, that's the price, the value exchange, right? So within marketing's definition, the 4 P's are also included. The next part is this idea of exchanging, right? So this is this exchange of value, that you have something that you think they want, as in the customer, and they are willing to give you something for that product or brand or service, right? So there's an exchange of value. And what value is basically the key component of marketing. And in fact, I would argue probably the key component of business in general. Throughout all of history, the only reason we have business is because of this idea that people can't do everything themselves and they have to exchange value. They have to either barter in the old days, I make the honey, you get the fish, and we trade. Or now in this current day, you exchange value typically in monetary fashion. I've got some money which I've earned from working for an organization which I provide value to. The organization sees value in what I do, so they give me money. I take this money, which is basically a metaphor for value, and I feel like some honey, and so I will spend my value, which is money, to get that value, which is honey, and then I will, carry on, and the rest of society works a very similar way. So marketing fits in very, very critically to this idea of business, which revolves around this idea of value. Now, in terms of what value is, though, that really depends on society, right? Different societies value different things. And in this globalized economy, many of us value the same things now. But in saying that, there are still subcultures in different regions where their society is set up in a way that they value different things. And so when we talk about value, it's about exchange between benefits and costs. I mentioned before about how cost is usually thought about in terms of monetary costs, but it could also be things like time cost and energy cost or effort cost, right? And so when you exchange value with a customer, they're thinking, well, what's it going to cost me? Both in terms of how much it costs financially, but also the time and the effort I'm going to have to invest to do business with you. And so when what marketing is all about is trying to maximize that value on both parts. What can we do to our product or our service that maximizes the amount of benefit the customer sees and minimizes the amount of cost that they see, while operating within an environment where you're trying to maximize your own value, as in charge them a premium for the product or service, but at the same time not doing it so much that the cost part of their equation outweighs the benefit part of their equation, so what's happening in their mind. And that sort of calculation can only occur within an understanding that society is made up of many different types of products, many different types of services, many different types of competitors, and many different types of customers, all operating to try and maximize the perceived value of their product or service to the customer. And so this is that competitive environment that I mentioned in one of my earlier slides. But the role of marketing is about value. And so when you approach your assignments and you're looking to think strategically, apply marketing strategy to your client company, value should always be at the top of your mind. What does this company currently offer in terms of value? How is that value perceived by their customers? How can they increase the value offering or the perception of value? Can they maximize it in a way that allows them to charge more without appearing to cost more to the customer? Can they do other things that are also beneficial in terms of value offering, so that the amount of benefits perceived in relation to the brand or service increases? Are there things that competitors are doing where they're seen as more beneficial, i.e. more valuable? Can we do things to our cost structure so that it reduces, thereby increasing the benefits of the value offering that we're trying to exchange with our customers? Are there other customers we could go for that would see our offering as more beneficial and less costly? So these are those strategic level, big picture, decisions and thoughts that you have to have before you even start to think about those tactics of how you're going to achieve certain goals, right? So if you keep value at the top of your mind, that's going to be essential for you as a marketer, but also when you start to think strategically. Within our paper, which is called Marketing 301, we have a strategic marketing framework. So I won't cover too much of it here on this video because it's quite unruly to look at on a video like this. And I actually like to break it down into several components and relate it to the assignment. So that kind of goes beyond what my intention of this YouTube video is. And I'll go through the next couple of slides fairly quickly, and then for those of you that are in my class, we will spend more time on this 301 strategic marketing framework, which is a framework that the 301 team put together many years ago to try and put everything that needs to be considered by strategic marketers into one place. So the theory is if you apply this framework to your strategic marketing projects, whether it be an assignment or real life, then you can be fairly confident you've considered everything that is of importance. That's not to say that you're going to be able to do everything or have the information to, confidently say you've covered this entire framework, but it's kind of like an ideal standard, right? In this framework is everything that needs to be worried about when you start to do strategic marketing assignments or projects. So the first part of the framework starts at the top, and we talked about the corporate level versus the strategic business unit, and then the product level. Then we move down to various frameworks that are quite well known already, like your SWOT or your TOES analysis, as well as your external analysis, such as your PESTIT or PESTLE, sometimes it's called, and Michael Porter's 5 forces. And there's a number of other things we ask you to consider. So we'll go through this more in more detail in the actual assignment. The next part of the model talks about value. So if you recall a few slides ago, I talked about how marketing is all about value. And so we have an entire section in our marketing framework devoted to really analyzing value, right? What drives it? How can we develop it? What do customers want, and how do we try and figure that out? The last part of the slide is about the tactical marketing strategy, right? So this is the stuff that you actually do once you've nutted out the value that you're going to offer. And so within that, we talk about how there's this triad or this relationship between the customers, the company, and the employees, right? And how those three things have to be aligned. And we talk about how, there's the link between the company and the customer is what we call an external marketing promise. So this is what the company is telling they are going to offer to the customer. And then between the customer and the employees, that's the interactive marketing. So this is what the staff need to do in order to keep those promises that the company has just made to the customers. And then down the bottom, linking the employees with the company is internal marketing, right? So this is the stuff that you do that help your staff deliver on those promises, right? It's enabling them to make those promises possible. And so those three components between your staff, your customer, and your company have to be aligned. And then within that triad are the various things you're talking about, like your offer development, your customer experience management, your user experience, understanding of what happens, all those sorts of things that the company needs to do in order to enable their staff to deliver on and keep those promises that the company has made in the first place to the customer. And then down the bottom, we talk about monitoring and evaluation in terms of figuring out if what you're planning to do has actually occurred and how you move forward from that point. Another concept I like to bring up in terms of marketing strategy are the 5 C's. And I like the 5 C's because they are A, easy to remember, and B, they pretty much cover everything you need to worry about when you start to think about marketing strategy. I've separated here into 4 at the top and 1 down the bottom. The reason why there's a separate a gap in the middle is because the top 4 are about the external environment, right? It's all about customers, so these are the people outside the company who you serve. It's about the competitors, what other people are doing that is going to interrupt or alter your perception of value that customers have of your brand. But they also include collaborators. So these are people external once again, but they might be willing to help or able to help or wanting to help because there's a reciprocal sort of benefit there. And then finally the context. So this is the external environmental forces typically you see in PESTIT or PESTLE analysis, right? So these are the sets of circumstances around you, the situation, right? And so you need to sort of consider those 4 things as well as obviously the internal analysis, which is the company. That's the 5th C, and that's what you can do. So you'll already notice that a lot of the stuff you need to consider within marketing strategy is external to the company, right? It's about the customers, the competitors, your potential collaborators, and the context. Whereas, only one part of it is about what you can do as a company. And so placing emphasis on the first 4 C's which are external to the company, is what we call outside-in marketing. It's about understanding the things outside the company first before looking into the company to figure out whether it can do the things it needs to do in order to enact a strategy and achieve a goal, or in some cases, does it need to change in some way in order to be able to cope with the findings of what is happening external to the company. The customers may be changing, the competitors may have a new innovation, collaborators may have shifted, the context may be changing. So it's always more important, in my mind, to understand what's happening around you first before you try and figure out how you as a company are going to approach it. Because if you take what we call as an inside-out approach to marketing strategy, that means that you're already blinkered. You're already focusing your perspective on what the company can do first, which may not always be the best thing to do. So if you start off with an internal analysis and you think, well, these are our limits and these are our strengths, then it really does color how you approach the external environment. Whereas if you start from the outside first and work in, then it might make you think, well, actually, there's something happening with the competitors that's really important. And even though an internal analysis of the company suggests that, we can't currently do it, the data is so overwhelming that we need to change something about our company internally, right? And so I always advocate for an outside-in approach to marketing rather than an inside-out approach to marketing. So something we haven't quite yet talked about is what happens when there are other strategies that are already inexistent within the organization that you're joining or working for. So that is a legitimate question. Like, when you go into an organization, it's unlikely they don't have a strategy currently in place. They will be making analytical decisions about how to allocate their resources and what tactics to implement before you arrive and probably after you've left. So that's the other thing that I just want to consider within this one slide, is that a firm's strategy consists of stuff that's currently happening, the analytical decisions they're making right in the present, as well as the new strategies that hopefully you will be proposing or other people in your team, right? Stuff that needs to be actively pursued in order to change the way they're making decisions at this point in time to work towards a different goal, or maybe work towards the same goals more efficiently. And then finally, there's strategies that happen that are reactive. That's stuff you can't plan for, because remember, you're operating within an environment of competitive uncertainty. And so things will happen. The competitors will do something, or customers will do something in a way that's unpredictable, and you need to then change the type of analytical decisions you're making in order to, survive or react in a way that maximizes or maintains the value that you're trying to offer. So I know it's a lot of information to take in what is essentially the first lecture on strategy. I guess the thing about strategy is that if it's not difficult, then you're probably not doing it, right? That's what they say about strategy. If it's easy, then it's not strategic. And that is because strategy is the analytical decisions you make under conditions of competitive uncertainty, involving limited resources and things you can't predict within a limited time frame, across a whole range of different factors that you can't control, right? So there's all this stuff that's happening. So obviously it should be slightly overwhelming, because if it was easy, then it wouldn't be strategy. It would just be, as I go back to one of the first slides I talked about, it's not just a choice between a hamburger and a cheeseburger, right? These are analytical decisions you're making because your business has limited resources. If it didn't have limited resources, then the decisions would be easy. You don't really need to make any decisions. You just do everything, right? But because all businesses have limited resources, you have to make tough decisions. And so strategy should be tough. It should be quite challenging. It's analytical. So that means you're thinking critically about what are you going to do to spend the limited resources you have in the best way possible, given what the company can or can't do currently, in order to pursue those very specific goals, because you can't pursue everything. Right? So all these factors make strategy quite challenging, But that's also what's really cool about it, because you're in this environment where you're trying your best, and there's no right answer. And if you do everything really well, it could go great, and you feel really good. You could plan everything as much as you want, and it could still go wrong because of competitive uncertainty, right? So it's unpredictable, it's uncomfortable. And another famous saying is, if it's comfortable, then it's not strategy, right? So you should be feeling slightly uncomfortable. The benefit within this course is that obviously you're working with a business, and there's no actual financial loss involved. You're not actually spending money. You're just proposing that the business should do this or do that. And at the end of the day, it will be the business that decides whether they take that risk or not. And I often ask the businesses, when they're assessing between different strategic decisions that different students might be offering them, is, okay, why don't you ask the student whether they would spend that money if it was their own? So think about that. Would you spend that money if it was your own? And that really is the approach you should be taking when you approach these assignments. You're proposing a whole bunch of stuff at the end of the semester for the client. Now, to put a little bit more sort of, meat in the game, you want to think, okay, if I was actually proposing that I spent this money, if I had to mortgage my house, or if I had to take on some debt to do this, am I still convinced this would work? Right? And that's the, level of care we want you to put into your strategic decision-making report when you propose to the client, that they should do something that you're suggesting. Do you really believe it yourself? Have you done the homework? Have you done the research to really feel confident that what you're asking the client to do is the best analytical decision to make? So where to start? Before any decisions are made, you have to do some of this background research and homework, as I mentioned, right? So a lot of it is to understand the marketplace dynamics. So what products offer the most value, but also, what other people are doing that are essentially competing for that value exchange. Which segments offer the best return on investment for future growth? Which regions, so geographically speaking, offer the best return on investment and future growth? The company's available resources. So this is where internal analysis is important, because you do need to have a realistic idea of where the company is at, so that you know what type of tactics are actually feasible or not. Or if they need to, take out a loan to do something, if you think that is the best decision to pursue those goals that you think are the best goals. And finally, the company's strengths and weaknesses. So this isn't just, from an operational point of view or an asset and liability sort of understanding of the company, but also the management team, right? In a client that one of my students' teams worked with a few semesters ago, they had a client that had a really strong idea about where that business should go and the type of target, the geographical region it should be targeting. And my students, I could tell they were struggling with it, because they would come to my office hours and they would say, we can't convince the business owner to target this other group of people, right? Go to this other region. He's really stuck on just this one area. And so that is, a weakness in terms of the management of the company, right? Logistically, the client could have targeted the other geographical region that my students were suggesting, but something in that person's thought process stopped them from wanting to do that. And they really limited the potential of their business by only focusing on something that was a limited marketplace. And so the strengths and weaknesses are also about understanding the management of that business. And this is where marketing strategy crosses over with consultancy. And I run this paper in a way that is kind of a pseudo marketing strategy, brand consulting sort of mix. Because you don't only just want to approach the project using only the marketing sort of tools, because some of your analysis might suggest that there is management issues, or supply chain issues, or literal, or actually, physical operational issues. I had another group of students work with a restaurant as their client, and the one thing their research told them was that the place needed more seating, right? And so part of their recommendations, even though it's a marketing paper, part of their recommendations was actually to invest in the outdoor area of this restaurant so that during winter or when the weather is not so good, you can still have double your capacity, right? So it seems like a very simple solution. However, they had to consider a whole bunch of other stuff happening there. They had to take off their marketing blinkers and really think across silos. In this case, it was more of a logistical sort of suggestion, not really a marketing investment, but it made the place better, and therefore it allowed the place to offer better value to the customer. And at the end of the day, marketing is about value, right? How can you maximize the value the client company is offering? So it's the importance of information when you do this background research. It's not just all data is good data. You want to identify, first of all, that it's accurate and correct information. Then you want to understand that, right? Make sure you're not misinterpreting whatever data you're collecting. Then from that, you should be able to identify some opportunities, right? So thinking outside in, once again. And then and only then should you start to develop your strategy, making those analytical decisions about, okay, given the resources we have, what tactics are we going to implement and execute? So how are you going to implement and execute that strategy? And then finally, in an ideal world, you can gather information for evaluation of that strategy that you've just implemented. And then it feeds back and you collect more information again, understand, identify newer opportunities, develop your strategy from there, implement new tactics, and repeat the cycle. So this, I guess, chain of events is basically what you will be doing in the assignment. And this is probably what you'll be doing in the real world as well, if you ever are in a position of making strategic level decisions. I've got this 4-step process for any strategy, and this is really one way to kind of summarize everything and bring it all together. So the 4 steps are very easy. First of all, they're easy to say, they're just very difficult to do. But if you do these 4 things, then any strategy you implement will be pretty solid. It's just how well you do these 4 steps that I guess becomes the key determinant, right, in terms of the quality of your execution. So the first thing is to understand the situation, right? And so this was the 5 C's that we talked about. You want to understand the customers, understand your competitors, understand your collaborators, understand the context in which you're in, and then finally understand what your company can or can't do, or how it should change in order to be able to do the things you need it to do to get to those goals. So understanding is a large part, the first part of the strategy. Second thing is to start planning. So then once you understand stuff, you can start to plan your approach. And this is where the resource allocation becomes critical. Remember, you've got limited resources. So in your planning, you should take into account, given these limited resources, where are we going to concentrate them? What are we going to do? And then what you're going to do is the next step, the step 3, which is execute your tactics. So remember, these are things that your business can realistically do without crippling itself with more debt. And also within the time frame so that it doesn't need to retrain a whole generation of staff in order to do it. Some of these things obviously can be sort of future plans, but realistically, strategic plans are, within a year, perhaps per quarter, so they're, maybe even a month. And so you want to do stuff that is pretty actionable. And then there's always the feedback loop, right? So strategy isn't one big thing you do only once. It's stuff that you're actually doing sort of on a fairly regular basis because you want to keep uncomfortable. You want to keep moving forward. You don't want to ever sit back and rest on your laurels and do one strategy and go, oh, that was great, let's just sit back and relax now. No, because remember, strategy is uncomfortable and comfort is the enemy of success, right? So comfort is the enemy of success. So to remain successful as a business, you have to constantly be uncomfortable. And that means once you've executed your tactics that you can do now, you want to look for the next thing that you can do that actually stretches your business, forces them to go in a direction that's better for them. It's kind of like doing squats at the gym. It's not comfortable, but it's kind of one of the best things you can do, right? Because it is uncomfortable, it makes you grow, and that's where you get all your development. And the final step is to evaluate. So this is that feedback loop we talked about, right? So you want to evaluate the result of your strategy with data, not just kind of like a hunch or emotion, right? You want to actually measure, did we sell more? Did we get more customers? Do we have greater brand awareness? Do our retailers look upon us more favorably now, and are they willing to accept more products in the future? All these sorts of things, they should ideally be quantifiable. They should have a number that you can use so that you can compare it with what they were before your strategy and what they are now, and then a historical as well for when you move forward for a different strategy to see how the next strategy pans out, right? And so this goes back around to the beginning of the cycle again, where you go understand, plan, execute, evaluate.